Hello and welcome to HMG Network, broadcasting live from the Greater Metropolitan. My name is Freeman Singirankabo, and thank you for joining us for another power-packed message of truth to power. Today's conversation, we are going to be discussing a reporter's experiences in post-genocide Rwanda. Our moderator for today is going to be none but my brother Claude Gatebuke. I'm wondering if Claude Gatebuke can hear me. Claude Gatebuke, can you hear me, buddy?
Yes, Freeman, I can hear you.
Good morning. Good morning. How are you?
Good morning. Doing pretty good. How are you
doing?
doing?
Take it away, man. Take it away.
Excited. All right. We are excited today to host today's event, and we welcome every one of you, those of you who are watching on your televisions, but also those of you who are watching on social media, Facebook and YouTube. And we ask, if you're watching on social media, please do share so that others can join this important conversation. Today, I'm excited that the guest that we have, but you hear a little bit more about him from my co-host. But just to frame the conversation for today, here is a narrative that we've got since the genocide. Of course, most people know Rwanda because of the Rwandan genocide in 1994. And also through other events and things that's happened. It's mostly about the genocide. But then there's a narrative about how great a president Paul Kagame is, the government of Rwanda. But there's so much that's hidden in terms of what's happened in Rwanda post-genocide and also in the region, not only in Rwanda, but Congo. And today's guest is going to share all about his experiences in the region. We will also, of course, remember the victims of the genocide in 1994, the victims even before and after the genocide, inside and outside of Rwanda. So I am excited to be hosting this, co-hosting this with the fabulous Nadine Kazuba, and I wanted to turn it over to Nadine Kazuba to introduce our guest and get the conversation started. Nadine, welcome.
Thank you, Claude, and thanks to the audience. Thank you, everybody who's tuning in for this broadcast. So yeah, today we have a special guest. He's a journalist, an author, and he's award-winning. He has reported from Africa and Middle East for New York Times and Associated Press. He has also written several books, and one of them is called Bad News. This one right here. Bad News, Last Journalist in a Dictatorship. He has also written Springer, Journey in the Congo. He has also written The Road Through War, Anarchy and Rebellion in Central African Republic. But before I introduce our guest, I'm just going to give you a little bit of geography about Rwanda, because that's what we're going to be talking mostly about. And our talk is mainly going to be based on this book, Bad News, that focuses on Rwanda. You can find it on Amazon. It's a very interesting book. I myself, as Rwandan, I actually learned a lot reading this particular book. So Rwanda is a small country located in East Central Africa, and it has came pretty much a lot of people learned about Rwanda when there was a genocide in 1994, and then also there was a movie that was done about that genocide called Hotel Rwanda, and we're also going to talk about that because the hero of the movie Hotel Rwanda is currently in jail in Rwanda, and that's another thing we're going to talk about. It's some kind of injustice that was done to him because he was kidnapped from Dubai and he was taken to Rwanda unjustly. So we will talk about that towards the end of the broadcast. But let me not take your time and go ahead and introduce our guest, Anjan Sundaram. And he's going to talk to tell us a little bit about himself. And then also, my first question to him is, how did you in the world get interested into going to Rwanda and Congo? Out of any other countries in the world, how did you choose to go to Rwanda and Congo? Welcome, Anjan.
Yeah, so thank you, Nadine, thank you, Claude. And I guess I want to start by echoing Claude's words. This is April, it's a month of commemoration of the genocide in Rwanda, so just want to remember all the victims and also echo Claude's words, remember all the victims before and after in Rwanda, in Congo, from all the conflict that has ensued following the Rwandan genocide in 1994. So it was a huge event in the region. So thank you for having me today. I'm very pleased to be on your network and join your community. How did I get interested? I guess the story of my getting interested in Congo and Rwanda and the region was, I wrote that in my book, Stringer. So I was a math student at Yale. I was studying mathematics. I thought I was going to be a maths professor. And I remember one lunchtime, I was at Yale University. And so I opened the newspaper at lunch in the dining hall at Yale. And in the middle of the newspaper, at the bottom of the page, was this very small article about like millions of people had died in Congo in the war there. I think 4 million at the time, now it's 6 million. And it didn't make sense to me, like, why is this article so small and in the middle of the newspaper buried somewhere? And so many millions of people have died. This should be on the page. To me as a student, I was 21 years old. It didn't make sense. And so I in my book, Stringer, I describe how I ended up dropping mathematics. I got my degrees and I sort of graduated, of course, but I dropped my career in mathematics and I kind of showed up as a 22-year-old in Congo to learn journalism and learn how to become a journalist and see what makes the news. Why doesn't this huge war with millions of people dying, why doesn't this make the news? And I guess to cut a long story short, in the connection to Rwanda happened when I was in Congo, because when I was in Congo as a journalist, as a young journalist, working for the Associated Press and the New York Times eventually, I ended up visiting some sites of massacres, massacres both in Equateur and in Congo's western province, Equateur, and also in the east, in the Kivus. And when I showed up, I had no understanding of how the Congo war was linked to Rwanda, but coming to these mass graves, I kind of I learned at that time, and this is 16 years ago now, that actually following the Rwandan genocide in 1994, in 96 and 98, Rwandan soldiers invaded Congo twice, and the soldiers went all the way across Congo, all the way to Kinshasa. And so I some of these survivors of those massacres. And so then I began to realize, these soldiers, these Rwandan soldiers, accompanied by Congolese militias, rebels at the time, they've left behind a series of mass graves across Congo. And there are survivors of these killings. And so these killings were then eventually documented in the UN mapping report of 2010, which was a very important report that the UN investigators issued. But it really so that's to answer your question in brief, I went from Yale to Congo, and then when in Congo, I realized how it was linked to Rwanda, and that the history of conflict in this region is very intertwined. And you can't just talk about one conflict alone, you have to talk about them all together and understand these histories.
Thank you, Anjan. It's good to see you again. I'm really excited to once again get an opportunity to actually share the stage with you and Nadine. And it's interesting. This is going to be an interactive conversation. And Freeman did the introduction, but feel free to jump in also, Freeman, whenever something happens. But I just wanted to ask you, before we continue, did you read how we prepared for this show? Because you pretty much just touched on the whole conversation in the introduction.
I figured that I thought I would give a quick summary for our viewers, for people listening in. Also to understand that there's a lot of controversy and polemic about Rwanda, about Kagame. There's a lot of competing narratives. But my story was not. I wasn't looking for trouble. I came to Congo looking to become a journalist. I came to Rwanda to teach a group of Rwandan journalists, very brave journalists, and to write my Congo book. And so what I've learned has been sort of largely through just pure reporting, not looking for a narrative one way or the other.
Good. Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, that's one thing. Every time we have these talks, there is no way to leave Congo out when we're talking about war in Rwanda and genocide and massacres. We can't leave one out. It's like it just seems like it's a regional war. It's not just particularly Rwanda. It's just a whole regional war. So back to the book, Bad News. Let me go with the first chapter because that was very interesting. Grenades. So there is an explosion, and just like anybody will be curious, you just took your camera and you had a lot of questions in your mind. So you got there, and then tell us what happened, because that was yeah.
You know, Kigali. Living in Kigali, you often hear about grenades going off. And grenade will be launched sometime at a bus stop, sometimes at a market, sometimes in the city. The strange thing is that often they don't kill too many people. And so at the time I was there at least, and so there was rumors that they're being used by parts of the army. You know, the grenades are being launched to show they're not happy with Kagame. Not to kill people, but to show that they're not happy, that people are not happy with his rule. And so one of these blasts happened when I happened to be in the center of Kigali, near Kiyovu, and near the Hotel de Mille Collines. You know, you mentioned Hotel Rwanda. The Hotel de Mille Collines is the former Hotel Rwanda. And I heard this blast go off, and I guess most people would run away. And but being a journalist, and I was a journalist, I was also training journalists at the time in Rwanda. I was teaching Rwandan journalists. I sort of heard this blast, and then I made my way up the hill after a little pause to see where it came from, what was happening. And when I reached the site, I could see broken glass on the road. I could see the signs of a grenade blast, and people were sweeping them up already. It was so fast. You know, people were cleaning the streets already, and the policeman was there, and I asked him, you know, what happened and where's the grenade? He said nothing happened. He's like, listen, nothing happened here, very clearly. And so that was almost wild for me, because nobody would talk about the grenade blast. And 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, you know, when nobody's talking about it, you begin to question yourself. Did that grenade blast happen? Did I hear it myself? And so you begin to question reality. And this is the power of Kagame's rule in Rwanda. Everything is so controlled. Nothing is reported. My journalist students who had also been on site, their cameras were confiscated, their film was confiscated. You know, nobody was allowed to document. This was not reported in the newspapers, any of the radio stations. And so after 2 or 3 weeks, you start to think, oh my God, like, is this real? Did it really happen? And so it shows how Kagame, the president of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, is able to, you know, manipulate reality and control what is spoken about, what is seen, what is accepted as real and not real. And so to anybody else, to a few of my friends who lived in Kiyovu, I checked with them, they also had heard the blast. Yeah. But to people who had not heard it for themselves, it didn't exist. It was erased from history. It was erased from reality. And so that is powerful.
Oh my. Yeah, that was very interesting, because, I mean, I don't live in Rwanda, but anywhere I've lived in the world, when there is such a thing that is dangerous to the population, it has to make the news. People have to know what is going on. People have to know what's next. How do we have to protect ourselves from these things happening again? But it was very scary for me to actually see how that information was being suppressed, how they did not want you to report on what was happening. Yeah, so that was kind of interesting. And then let's move on to, you mentioned about harassment and terrorism.
Nadine, real quick, I just want to also share. I don't know if Anjan, if you've heard about this story that's going on in Rwanda. There's a similar thing happening. So what you were talking about when you were there is still happening now. There's this, I don't know if you want to maybe share with the audience a little bit about this story, very similar, so that the audience who are unfamiliar with this, you know, can kind of understand that this is not old. This is still happening.
Yeah, so there is a trending story. It's on one of the independent channel called Ishema TV. It's run by a journalist called Kuma Hassan, who actually just got out of the prison recently. He was imprisoned for just criticizing the government, really, and then he was released completely innocent after 9 months, I believe. But the story is about this guy called Twagirimana Jean de Dieu. He was shot by the Rwandan police. They came, they found him in his home. They took him away because when they came, the people came to see what was happening. Why is he being arrested? But they did not say anything. They just took the guy and they were kind of pushing the people to see what they were going to do with him. So they shot him dead. And the people heard the shots, and they tried to kind of get close and to see what's happening. Why are you shooting this guy? And the Rwandan police and other authorities who were there, they were preventing the people to actually get closer to the body. And they finally took the body. They put the body in the body bag and took the body away with them. That story happened on the April 13, I believe. Yeah. Yesterday, when I was watching the news on the same channel, one of the family members, she was actually still complaining that they haven't been able to see the body. They've been requesting to get the body of their loved ones. They have not been able to locate where the body is. The Rwandan government doesn't want to give them the body so they can give him a proper burial. So and then some of the authorities in Rwandan government are coming with these allegations about the dead body, that he was a thief, that he has killed somebody, he has castrated someone. I mean, like all these crazy allegations. And the family is like, so where all these are coming from? You never said anything when this guy was alive, but now you are coming with the allegations. So that's just to tell you how there is so much injustice, and it's completely not spoken by anybody. But I mean, there's some journalists who are starting coming out, and they're facing a lot of harassment. And I'm sure you, like we said, you've seen that. So that's a story I'm telling you about. Like, that's kind of similar to some of the stories I read in your book.
Yeah, it's not just, it's not just grenade blasts. It's people being, shot dead. It's people being kidnapped from their homes. Their families don't know where they are. They can't talk about it. Taken to prison where they're allegedly tortured. Human Rights Watch and other organizations have documented torture in these secret detention centers or prisons. It's even like the GDP growth rate. It's everything. Like, you can't talk, you can't challenge the government. If the government said Jean de Dieu was not shot dead, or Jean de Dieu was, castrated someone, that becomes the truth. If the government says the GDP is growing at 8%, that becomes the truth. Whatever the government says becomes the truth, because, nobody can report on what they see and what they feel.
So if Kagame today tells us the earth is flat, basically everybody's gonna say, yeah, the earth is flat. That's how it goes in Rwanda.
That's how it is in Rwanda. Yeah, that was scary. And also, yeah, you mentioned some of your students who actually, like when you was teaching journalism in Rwanda, some of your students had to go through this, like Moses, who had his leg smashed in a torture chamber. There is Agnes, who was imprisoned. There is also one of the guy named Jean Bosco, who was in coma for 4 days after getting beaten up. So it's terrible. I don't even know how people live there, because it sounds like a total prison to me. Yeah. And then
the journalists, I have to say, you mentioned a few of those journalists. The time that I spent with those journalists who are just so incredibly brave for me. I learned more about journalism from them than from, my very famous journalist friends who have won Pulitzer Prizes for international reporting and, all kinds of international journalism prizes. But I learned more from about journalism, about my own job, from watching those very brave Rwandan journalists. Because in Rwanda today, it's so dangerous to be a journalist. It's so dangerous to try and report on the truth. And these journalists were risking everything. For me, maybe I risked being thrown out of the country because I'm a foreigner. I have some privileges. But as a Rwandan journalist, your family is living there, you have land there, your children go to school there, you maybe have a loan from the bank. All of these things are controlled by the government. And your children can be expelled from school. Maybe you ask for some passport or you ask for official government papers to move or some permission, and they don't give it to you. They give you trouble. You have a loan at the bank. The bank says, "Oh, you got to repay your loan." You can have so much trouble so easily. Your land can be grabbed. One day your land is yours. One day it's gone. I knew of human rights defenders in Rwanda. Their names were removed from their bank accounts. So they went to the bank and they were like, "No, your account is not in your name anymore. Sorry, you don't have an account here." And so all kinds of things can happen so easily if you dare to speak out and criticize the government. So those Rwandan journalists who, despite all these risks, they still went ahead and reported on Kagame's abuses of power. It was so brave. It was seeing real journalism happening before me. And as their teacher in this training program, I had the privilege of being very close to them and sort of following them day by day. They let me in, they let me into their worlds. And so I had the privilege of learning so much about what journalism means, what it means to hold power accountable. That's journalism. And these Rwandan journalists, and there are a few still today brave enough to try, but dozens of journalists have been arrested, tortured, killed, or forced to flee Rwanda after criticizing Kagame, that I'm just amazed that there are still so many brave Rwandan journalists still today who still dare to oppose him.
Actually, Anjan, someone was asking in the audience if Peter Farlinden was asking the question: is it are things changing because there are brave journalists who are jumping in and actually reporting these things, and they're reporting injustices and things like that? Do you think things are changing, or is it just temporary? Because we remember back in the 2000s, there was also a group of journalists like Nelson Gatsimbazi, the Didas Gasanas, then the Charles Cabanero, and Elenia Sakanga, and a bunch of them, and Agnes, who was one of your students, Jean Bosco Gasasira was one of your students. All of those guys, I think they're very brave, and today they're all in exile except for Agnes, I think. So are things changing, or is this just those glitches like these guys were doing back in the 2000s?
I think it's getting tighter and tighter, the control, unfortunately. So Kagame has hit even harder on opposition, and I think the easiest obvious way to see this is, in 2010 Kagame won the presidential election with 93% of the vote. In 2017, he won the presidential election with almost 99% of the vote. So it went from 93% to 99%. So that's an obvious indicator that things are getting tighter. He's even more paranoid, or even more repressive on any critical voice. He wants to shut it down even more. And it's gotten worse and worse. I think, like most activists, real change can only come from people within Rwanda who are brave. And I think one of those people, for example, is Christopher Kayumba, who just announced that he was going to be a presidential candidate, and then promptly was accused of, sexual allegations against him, and which is standard operating procedure. Victoire Ingabire had sexual smears, misogynistic smears against her. I remember in the 2017 elections, there was also a similar case, like there were nude photos of the opposition candidates. circulating. So this is kind of standard for Kagame. But I think what needs to change for change to happen in Rwanda and the region is that these brave people need to have support from outside, real support. Because what is the situation today is that Kagame's government is largely financed by the West. The country runs on aid. Kagame, he's very persuasive and he's a great speaker in some ways. Like, you know, his message is very seductive and very appealing to a lot of people who want to see a powerful leader in Africa. But the truth is that he is a puppet leader. His elections are rigged. You know, opposition candidates can't contest him. He wins with almost 99% of the vote. His government is largely funded by Western powers. So who is he? Is he a leader that is representing the Rwandan people as he says he is, or is he a leader who is financed by the West, you know, because of military power from military and financial aid from the West, and also ruling because of rigged elections, you know, fake elections. So that's the truth. But his message is so different. The way he talks is so seductive. I think support that Kagame gets needs to change. And some of these brave individuals who unfortunately have been, you know, have paid with their lives or are largely in exile. There are many brave and very intelligent Rwandans who, you know, were in government, were in journalism, who have ideas for how Rwanda can be a more accountable society, a society that, you know, has a lower likelihood of violence in the future. I'm thinking also of Joseph Sebarenzi, who wrote this book, God Sleeps in Rwanda. There are so many people who've written intelligently with great ideas for Rwanda. But unfortunately, Kagame has eliminated all of them in one way or the other and, you know, created a system in Rwanda where he's the sole. And despite this, he gets aid from the West, military and financial foreign aid. So that needs to change.
Yeah, and it's even interesting, actually, like as you said in the book, how he gets away with a lot of things. I mean, Paul Kagame, like suppressing information like from UN, from World Food Program. Like World Food Program is conducting they find that, like in 2006 there was some kind of famine outbreak in Rwanda. That was it's been done by World Food Program. It's a research that's been done by World Food Program. So they announced, okay, there are so many people who are hungry in 2006. Rwandan government completely refused, and they said that was a lie, and they even prevented World Food Program to make that an official document about the famine in Rwanda. And then 2007, United Nations, they released a study that was showing that the number of impoverished people was higher than what it was in 1990, before Paul Kagame invaded Rwanda. So Rwandan government retaliated and they completely discredited the findings. They even requested to blacklist the researchers. They get away with that. And that kind of shows you how much power they give him. And I'm sure it's not his power. It's not Paul Kagame's power. It's the power that he's getting from the outside. And it's kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, it's totally ridiculous. If you ask, most people are not aware that when the World Bank publishes, you know, Rwanda's GDP or growth rate or poverty reduction rates, the World Bank doesn't check these numbers. It comes from the Rwandan government. The World Bank just publishes them. So people look at these numbers and think, oh, these are World Bank numbers. They must be true. You know, the World Bank has some credibility. But you ask the people at the World Bank, do you check these numbers? They're like, no. They just take the Rwandan numbers. And you see this even now with COVID, you know. In other countries have suppressed their COVID numbers, you know, changed their, you know, infection rates or death rates. And the World Bank and international organizations just publish them. And so, yeah, it's this power that they give him. You're totally right.
That's very interesting. Actually, I was going to ask about that because, again, we're citing reports like the World Food Program, you know, this copy-paste type of reporting where the government of Rwanda gives data to the World Bank and the World Bank just copies, paste over to their reports and they make them official. but then we also we have to struggle to actually get a report like the UN mapping report released that talks about atrocities committed by the government by the Rwandan troops and Ugandan troops and others in the Congo. And the M23 report, we had to stage a whole campaign to release that that report so that, you know, it can be demonstrated that Rwandan military leaders, General James Kabarebe, General Charles Kayonga, General Jack Nziza, who all report to Kagame, are advisors to Kagame, were actually involved in logistics, support, recruiting, and sponsoring of the M23 rebellion. All of that is suppressed. And you talk about the international community's support for Kagame. As you said, I personally also see him as a puppet. But what do you see as a trajectory in terms of, I mean, he's not the first puppet. You know, Mobutu was another puppet, and you lived in the Congo. So Mobutu was a major puppet for the US and in the Western nations. And also, I like how you started this conversation with how the story of the Congo was buried in the middle of like nowhere in a newspaper. And so these stories are buried, but what do you see as the trajectory in terms of making sure that this information is out there? Because they do try to control it, they do try to suppress it, but you know, there's also many ways now to get information out. And you talked about the coronavirus information suppression. I saw your tweets about it, where actually one of your friends was, you know, he died, or it was a friend of yours that died of coronavirus, and they reported that they died of something else. At the time, I think Rwanda was still reporting 0 casualties of coronavirus. Although personally, I was saying that there had already been casualties of coronavirus because they had already shot somebody for violation of coronavirus. So that person got killed because of coronavirus. Somebody had been beaten to death, you know, and it was related to coronavirus. And so there had already been casualties, but they actually are misreporting data, and they're also suppressing reports. But what do you see as a trajectory, like this kind of staying power?
Yeah, I mean, it's always hard to predict the future, right? It's always a dangerous thing to predict the future, and sort of the trajectory is of more and more control. And I guess I might lead with, when I was teaching the Rwandan journalists, I remember many of them came and asked me the same question, because they were doing very brave work, and they were asking me, you know, does this work have any meaning? Is Kagame going to keep being supported by the West? And this was like 11 years ago. Does our work, you know, does it matter that we're taking these risks? The Rwandan journalists were asking. And so I remember it happened to be an anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And Václav Havel, this famous Czech dissident, he often spoke, he wrote this very moving article about how before, you know, the Berlin Wall fell, before the end of the Cold War, he as a dissident, as an activist in the Czech Republic, people thought he was crazy. People said, you know, this government, the dictatorship is so powerful. Who do you think you are? You're trying to fight this dictatorship, you and your little friends. You're trying to do, you know, trying to get the truth out. And you're just crazy for doing that even. And then one day the dictatorship fell. And he himself said, I thought I was, you know, maybe crazy, you know, because the dictatorship seems so powerful. But then one day it just crumbles and it all falls down. So from one day to the next, that's how dictatorships go. That's how dictatorships fall. They seem super powerful, and they create this image of power because they suppress any opposition, any dissenting voice, any criticism. So if you go to Rwanda and you read the newspapers, you think everyone is supporting Kagame. Everyone loves him, because that's what everyone will tell you, because it's dangerous to say the opposite. But people who've lived in dictatorships, who've grown up in dictatorships, whether it's in Yugoslavia, whether it's in the Soviet Union, they see this 100% support and only good news. And they think to themselves, hey, where's the bad news? You know, there's got to be bad news. In any society, it's normal that people have different points of view. And Rwandans are no different from any other place in the world. They will have different points of view, but you don't see or hear anything. And so they realize, oh, there's something wrong here. And and a dictator, that's the sign of a dictatorship. There's only good news. And so that's the title of my book, Where's the Bad News? And so the characteristic of dictatorships is from one day to the next, you don't see how it happens, but they tend to crumble very quickly, whether that comes from internal forces or external, it's hard to say. But usually dictatorships that kind of don't have, dictatorships are unstable, less stable than democratic institutions. And that's, I think, a tragedy, and the real tragedy for the Rwandan people, because the genocide happened in 1994 at the fall of a dictatorship, and it unleashed this great violence. And today, Rwandans are living under a similar system. And it's a tragedy that they have to contemplate. Oh no, violence might be coming along because Kagame has just concentrated power. He's destroyed any hope for democratic institutions. And so the most academics, I think the academic consensus and most long-term Rwanda agree that a transition of power is very likely to be accompanied by violence. And that's a tragedy. That's the fault of Kagame. That's also the fault of the international community that supports him. And even as he destroys independent institutions, they support him. And so everyone's complicit, just as they were complicit in the regime prior to the 1994 genocide, which also received lots of foreign aid, was also praised as very efficient, very good at using foreign aid. All the same signs are there today. And so that's worrying. It's a concern in Rwanda.
But Anjan, how dare you ask for bad news in a country where the president is voted for 99% and 93%? I mean, there's no bad news. Even when he was extending his terms, he said that only 10 people in the country, only 10, like my fingers, thank goodness I have all of them. That's everybody that opposed him extending the terms. There's also a question from our good friend and colleague, Congolese friend Benedict Kumbinjoko, asking about, what are your famous journalist friends? You work for the New York Times, and the AP, and you've reported for all of those. What are they saying about these stories? Do they actually know the truth? And again, how come it's not being reported? Understood the role of the international community, but there's also the role of the press, the international press.
Yeah, I think individual reporters, I think, are very aware, whether it's the New York Times reporters. Jeffrey Gettleman wrote a report, The World's Favorite Strongman. Michaela Wrong just published a book, Do Not Disturb, about Patrick Karege's death, assassination in South Africa. So there are individual journalists who are aware, but somehow the consensus, the editors who, often have not traveled to Rwanda, don't have firsthand experience, they're sitting far away, they still believe in this narrative, which is very seductive. It's a narrative people want to believe, that, after the genocide in 1994 and this war, which everyone saw in the movie Hotel Rwanda, everyone saw on TV, it was televised. Everyone wants to believe that from the ashes of genocide, Kagame has rebuilt Rwanda to this prosperous nation on the right track. And that's a narrative, that's just so appealing that it's hard to get people to disbelieve that once they believe that. I think there's also another factor. If you haven't grown up in a dictatorship, in a repressive authoritarian state, if you come to Rwanda and you hear only good news, many reporters take that at face value and say, hey, that's what I'm hearing. That's what Rwandans are telling me. Who am I to disbelieve them? But if you've grown up in an authoritarian state, like I had, I grew up in Dubai, and you've worked in dictatorships, you understand instinctively that when everyone is saying the same thing, there's a problem. That means that, you're not getting the plurality of opinions that you would normally get in a normal place. And so you dig deeper. And I think more and more people are trying to dig deeper, trying to get that story out. It's becoming less acceptable to praise Kagame, but you're right. He still gets invited to Yale University, to Harvard University. He's still, praised for his poverty reduction and also for free speech. for promoting free speech, for rebuilding Rwanda and rebuilding Rwanda's democratic institutions. He's still praised for a parliament that is 50% women, for gender equality in Rwanda, when actually any woman who tries to oppose him is smeared misogynistically, and when that parliament that has 50% women has no power. So it's a meaningless kind of token gesture. So yeah, you're right, he's still praised, and I think that narrative of Rwanda's success after the genocide really took hold and is hard to dislodge. I think eventually it will be. The truth will come out and will be accepted. But it's just such a powerful narrative with Kagame has very powerful friends, Tony Blair, Bill Clinton, people at Davos, who perpetuate this narrative in circles of power. And he's been very smart and very effective in his propaganda campaigns. I think you have to recognize that.
All right. Yeah. So moving, because we're still talking about the control, Kagame's control, and which comes with the spying. He has a lot of spies. He sends spies to outside. Like, especially if you are a Rwandan critic, most of the time you have some spies following you, or some hitmen trying to kill you. It happens a lot, or kidnap you and send you to Rwanda. So in your book, you talk about Roger. Roger seemed to be one of the guy who came to you, seeming vulnerable, seeking for help, actually, like telling you how he's being prosecuted by the government. And he even showed you some of the sites where government was doing some damage to the people. Like, people are destroying their houses by law, by government telling them, okay, you have to destroy your house because we want Rwanda to look better. But by doing that, they're not giving them shelter. So people they were living in the houses with no roofs, being rained on, some having pneumonia and all that kinds of stuff. And that was a law that came from the government to tell the people to do that. And Roger took you to that place where that things were happening. And then in the end, it turned out to be Roger was a different kind of guy. Tell us the story about Roger.
Yeah, so Roger came to me. He presented himself as a journalist. He was saying all the right things, and he seemed, at the time, almost too good to be true. The perfect thing that Rwanda needed. They needed a journalist who was willing to speak truth to power, speak about human rights abuse, Kagame's government, who understand what universal human rights was, why Rwandan people deserve, like people everywhere else, to have the right to life, to not be killed at random, the right to speak, to say what they want, even if it's criticizing the government, the right to associate, to form of friends and people who share the same kinds of beliefs. All of these rights Rwandans don't have, and Roger was very sensitive to this. And he kind of, I really wanted to believe in him because all the other journalists were getting attacked and some shot dead, and others were fleeing the country. And so here was Roger, who seemed like a super brave, super intelligent journalist, who was exactly what Rwanda needed. And then I found out that people were scared of him, and they had been scared to tell me that they were afraid of him. And afterwards, when they saw me getting really close to him, some of my friends came to me and said, "You can't hang out with Roger." And I was like, "Why? He's so great." And they were like, "No, you don't know who he is." And I was like, "I can tell you who he is." They were like, "No, we can't tell you. He's that scary. We can't even tell you who he is because we're worried." Their response was, I was like, "Who is Roger?" And they were like, "Anjan, I have a family. Like, I can't talk about these things. Like, I have a family. I have to care for my family."
Wow.
But I'm telling you as your friend, don't hang out with him. And then one of my friends, Moses, told me to ask Roger certain very specific questions, where he lived, about his past. And I asked Roger these questions, and he lied and he wasn't clear. And that's when I knew that actually what my friends were telling me, some of my friends eventually told me, was true. that Roger was a spy. He'd worked in Rwandan military. He'd worked in counterintelligence. He'd been trained by Mossad. And when I confronted him about these things, he admitted to some of them. He said, "I used to be a spy. What do you want me to do? Go hang myself because of that?" But he said, "Now I'm a journalist." And that's what my Rwandan friends were telling me, no, he wasn't a journalist. He's still deployed on missions. And so I'm that Roger, because I was trying to help these journalists and because I was being critical of the government, Roger had been sent to kind of follow me and find out what I was doing. And I think till today, I think the reason nothing happened to me was because Roger wanted to know if I was in touch with Kayumba Nyamwasa, with Patrick Karegeya, people in exile, former Rwandan military generals, people with power and connections and who are willing to use force, military power to challenge Kagame. And I was not in touch with any of them. And I think that's what saved me. I was only interested in my Rwandan journalists who were being shot dead and killed, unjustly. And I wanted to help my Rwandan colleagues. And that was my only job. And I think Roger saw that. And so nothing happened to me. But I think he was deployed to me to understand if I was somehow connected to those people abroad whom Kagame is really scared of. He has tried to assassinate Nyamwasa a few times, Karegeya, he assassinated, obviously. And so Kagame is really worried about people who have access to guns. And people like Nyamwasa and Karegeya have a certain amount of loyalty within the Rwandan army. Soldiers are loyal to Nyamwasa also. They respect him. And so he poses a real threat.
And I was actually surprised that these guys, these spies, and they actually get training from like a country like Israel. They get trained by Mossad. I mean, that was something shocking to me because I was completely unaware of that. So they are very professional spies. And that's like, especially people who are abroad, people who are critics of government who live out of Rwanda. That's one thing people are not aware of. You get people come to you and they become very close friends. And eventually you happen to find out they were not up to something that is good. It has happened to Rusesabagina. We're going to talk about that story too.
Just to your point about Israel, I went to meet the M23 rebels in Congo. And I wrote a story, I published a story in Foreign Policy magazine. And they were telling me they were trained by Mossad. They were giving me like all kinds of details. These are rebels in Congo who are trained by Mossad with the support of the Rwandan government. They're trained in survival skills. They're put out in the desert and taught how to survive from plants and roots and to stay alive. And the M23 rebels, they had Israeli guns, Israeli pistols, revolvers. It was kind of wild to see how these networks extend. They're very professionals. These rebels in Congo, the M23 and others, they're not like some rebels from the bush with AK-47. These are very professionally trained soldiers who know what they're doing, who are getting financing, support, military arms from Rwanda, from the US, from Israel.
Interesting. So also let's talk about the Umudugudu. That was another interesting part, which is a system for control in Rwanda. Tell us more about the Umudugudu system, because I mean, if any dictator out there is not using that system, I guess they are missing out.
And also, while you answer that one, do you mind also like talking about how prevalent this culture of spying, because so many people are unaware, even Rwandans, like I said, they do not understand how somebody can be that close, like Roger, who came and became your friend, and actually they are on a mission to spy on you, sometimes on their own. Like they don't actually are not even getting paid, to do that. If you got any experience of that, but yes, talk about Umudugudu and this like, super sophisticated way of surveilling people. and also the prevalence of, like the do not disturb in that book. They talk about how, like, they're not even afraid of telling somebody, go kill your own family member, go spy on your own family member. And in some cases, they just so slick. Actually, in many cases, it's really slick. People don't even know that it's happening. So if you could talk about those two things, the Mudugudu, and I just want to take the opportunity to jump in and ask about the prevalence.
Yeah. I think they're related, right? Umudugudu and spying, they're all ways to their surveillance techniques. And you say you don't, like, I didn't realize with Roger, he was so well trained. He's trained in counterterrorism. Like, his job, his training as a counterterrorism agent is to go behind enemy lines and to pretend to be one of them and send intelligence back to base. So he's trained to be with the enemy. Roger is, and so many of these spies, they receive this kind of training. They're trained to make you believe that they're your friend, you can trust them. I remember in one village, it was in the north near Ruwengeri, I met a woman who informed her on her own son. So her son was part of rebel groups, FDLR, other rebel groups that had infiltrated into Rwanda and were fighting against Kagame. And she betrayed her own son. She informed on her son to Kagame's government and said, my son's at home, go arrest him. And so they went and arrested his son. And so the bonds of family are broken even in Rwanda, where your loyalty to the state, to the government, needs to be so complete, so total, that even your family ties are broken. So yeah, this is just powerful. And I guess coming to the Umudugudu, every time I would go to a village, every time I would go to someone's house, they had to inform the government that I was there. If I slept over at someone's house, the government, local authorities needed to know. And how does this happen? I guess this is the Umudugudu system. It's divided into little villages. Each village has about 100 families or something like that, a very small number. Each village has a chief, an informer, and orders pass from the center, from the government in Kigali, from the capital, to each Umudugudu very efficiently. So if someone sleeps in someone's house, if someone has a guest, that house will inform the Umudugudu chief. The Umudugudu chief will inform the district chief, the province chief, and it'll go straight up to Kigali very fast. And so the central government will know that someone is sleeping in that village, a guest is sleeping in that house, all the way down. If someone is a critic, says something against Kagame, that will be reported to the local informer from the Umudugudu. Everyone talks, everyone betrays each other. And the informers, the local chief will inform and will go all the way to Kigali. So the next person tries to get some government papers, a passport, something, they have trouble, because what they say and even what they think, what they say in the intimacy of their homes, to their families, in places where they think they can trust the others, even that is reported. And so it isolates everyone. And there's no space in which you can feel free, in which you can feel that you can talk about what you know, what you know really happened. And so that's why we have these narratives, like, these stories of the other people who died during the genocide, Kagame's forces, the people they killed. You can't talk about it. Even people who saw it with their own eyes, even survivors of the genocide survivors in Kigali can't talk about the killings that they saw Kagame's forces commit. And these are genocide survivors, every year, especially in this month of April, they're put on TV, they put on newspapers, as if these genocide survivors are special, are respected in Rwanda, but in reality, they're not respected. They can't talk about what they saw happen during the genocide, because Kagame's forces committed a lot of crimes, and they can't talk about any of this. They lost their family members not only to the Hutu government at the time, but also to Kagame's forces, and they can't talk about these victims. And so the Umudugudu, I guess, from what I understood from doing research, it's a very old system of governance in Rwanda. It's many centuries old, and Kagame, it was used to commit the genocide. When the government in 1994 launched the order to commit the genocide, it happened simultaneously across Rwanda because orders passed so efficiently from the Mudugudu to the center and back and forth. And so almost simultaneously across Rwanda, you had the killing start during the genocide. And so Kagame has, instead of stopping the system and saying it's a dangerous thing, Kagame sees it as useful for control, and he's made it even stronger. And so that's how Kagame governs and controls Rwanda today.
He's also exported it outside of the country. So this isn't just happening. The Mudugudu system and the surveillance and people telling on each other, you know, having conversations with people, you know, thinking this is a conversation with friends, it gets reported, you know, so like all of this information gathering is really like very centralized inside the country and outside of the country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can believe that. Yeah.
And also,
yeah,
I was saying how because of this high surveillance in Rwanda by the government, they fear, people have fear to the point where they kind of have accepted the mistreatment. Like, for example, this one thing that has really shocked me, like destroying their houses and just live outside in the open air where they're being rained on. And they are still praising that the government is actually telling them to do something that is appropriate. And these people, I mean, they have nowhere to live. But because of the surveillance, because of the harassment, they just become numb and start thinking that their oppressor is actually doing something positive for them. They are doing self-harm to themselves because of fear. But they can't come out of that thinking that it's actually harmful. They just accept it and believe that it's right for them. That was another. That was something that was very disturbing to me, actually.
Yeah, I wanted to add. There's some comments related to that. You know, so that you can also speak to that, and we can bring in the audience. And again, thank you everyone that's sending your questions and comments. And if you could continue sharing this conversation so that others can also join the conversation. But there's, for example, a comment from Mary Udis Bitiki that says the extrajudicial killings in Rwanda is beyond acceptable. How do we call this? Innocent souls taken away. That is so scary. Again, all of this going back to people doing self-harm or being harmed and not even being able to cry about it. There is, let's see, there was a couple of others. You know, Marianne Bazruiha saying that it seems like Rwandans have been sacrificed to unknown devil. Otherwise, why is it that the entire world is watching without empathy? And then, there's also another one from Shanti Urgeni saying, you're right, Nadine. He's getting away with it easily. Rwandan people must also win their fear and take back their power. Rwandans have given him too much power out of fear. So that's just some of the comments that have come through and questions basically related to, you know, what Nadine is talking about, people doing self-harm to themselves and still praising the government. How do you reconcile that?
Yeah, just to sort of tell the story of what Nadine is referring to. So, you know, at some point Kagame decided that, you know, thatched roofs, which are traditional roofs in Rwanda, and, you know, the thatched roofs were ugly. And so they needed to have metal roofs because that is modern and that's a sign of progress. And so Kagame just said this. And he said all the thatched roofs should be gone. And so what happened was, it's the people who are, you know, afraid, the fear is not just among the people, it's also among government officials. The government officials got so scared, they went to their local villagers and they said, destroy your roof. Kagame has said, your roofs are ugly, your roofs are primitive, you gotta destroy your roof. And so when I went to these villages, it was so surreal. I was traveling around these villages where and the houses had no roofs and people were sitting out in the open and children were falling sick. And so I was like, you know, who did this to you? Did the military come here? Did the police come here? Like, who did this violence to you? And their response was, no, we did it. We did it ourselves. We did it to ourselves because the government ordered us to do this. And so that was just so sad to see that they would obey. They were so scared of the government that they would obey to the point where they would destroy their own home. And then after that, if I asked them, what do you think of Kagame? Yes, they would praise Kagame. They would say, oh, he's such a visionary leader. He wants good for us. This has happened. They were saying this even as at the same time as their children were falling sick, because you cannot criticize Kagame even under those circumstances. Even if your child is not well, you have to be careful and you have to praise Kagame, because if you criticize him, something even worse is going to happen to you.
Oh yeah, that is very terrible. Yeah, so let's move on to the genocide part of the book and the story in general of Rwanda. So, like most of you, if you don't know, the month of April, it's one of the historical months in Rwandan history, because that's when the genocide started, and the Rwandan genocide, after they shut down the presidential plane that was carrying two presidents, not just only president of Rwanda, the late Habyarimana, but also the president of Burundi, Cyprien Haryamira. So after that, the Rwandan genocide started after they shut down the plane. And so Anjan, when you was in Rwanda, you had a chance to attend one of the commemoration event. And also, like when I was reading your book, there was some kind of like conflict between compassion versus violence. So you went there, but it didn't seem like what you was expecting is what you saw. Tell us more about the commemoration.
Right. So I went to a commemoration event with a survivor of the genocide in Rwanda, and yeah, I went there kind of expecting, the official narrative, which is, it's a very respectful ceremony. But yeah, a number of things about the commemoration were extremely disturbing. For example, there were children crying, children who, had not been born in the genocide, but who were crying, but not just crying. They were crying, but tears were coming out, their noses were running, spit was coming out of their mouth. It was really traumatic crying. And these children who had not even been born during the time of the genocide, you could not help but get the feeling that some part of the trauma of the genocide was being passed on to them, and it was being passed on to them during these commemoration events. Also, other things like you noticed that, at least I noticed that, there were all these coffins, caskets of bones going into the crypts, bones of the genocide survivors. That was these rituals. But, you had one casket full of like leg bones, one casket full of skulls. And, when I asked my Rwandan friends, and I think in most places of the world, when you find a dead body, you try to bury that body whole. You don't separate the skull and the leg bone and the hand bone, and you don't break it up. You want the body to be buried whole so that the soul can find peace and, go to heaven or whatever the rituals are. So even by traditional Rwandan customs, going back many centuries, or by Christian traditions, if you find a body and you just find a skull and a leg bone and a rib cage, because some of these bodies were from survivors from 1994, so they've been 15, 20 years. So sometimes you didn't find all the bones, but you would still try to bury them whole. But here, the Rwandan government would separate all the skulls together, and that gave the impression of spectacle. You see 50 skulls together, and you get the impression of like how many people died. So it's like the spectacle of the commemoration was being privileged, was more important than respecting the survivors, the integrity of and burying them, and so that the bodies find peace. And so there were a number of things that were disturbing about the commemoration. They're still true today. And Kizito Mihigo is one example. He used to be the face of the genocide commemorations, and he was shot dead in police custody. A number of people have tried to talk about how these commemoration events seem more violent than they seem respectful, and how they're used by Kagame for political power. And so that's something that I observed when I went to the commemorations. It was very, very disturbing. And I remember my friend the genocide survivor whom I went with.
Yeah.
And many genocide survivors in Rwanda, they won't attend the commemorations. They don't go. Well, I would hang out with them in April in their houses. I would ask them, why don't you go to the official commemoration at the stadium in which Kagame is there and everyone's talking, they're playing music and screening videos about the genocide. They were like, no, these commemoration events don't respect our experience of the genocide. We are survivors and we know what we experience and we don't feel respected when we go there. So we would rather stay at home, be with our friends, be with our fellow survivors, and that feels more respectful to us.
And also, speaking of that, also some educators have even told the government that showing the violent images on national television about genocide was making children becoming uncontrollable during the month of commemoration. But it seems like the government doesn't want to listen to that. They just want to keep doing, like instilling that type of trauma. What do you think is the reason why the government keeps pushing that? Like, I mean, because we all want to respect our dead ones. We want to move forward. We want to not stuff like that happening again. We want to live together as Rwandans. But why is that whole traumatic images, like that traumatic experience, is kept being pushed forward more than actually allow people to come together and create a Rwandan for everyone?
Trauma is control, right? The more traumatized people are, the more control Kagame has. Right. And so Kagame, everything about the genocide is how Kagame controls Rwanda. How Kagame controls Rwanda, how Kagame is also legitimized and receives support from the West. The genocide and his story of the genocide is the centerpiece of his narrative. So the more trauma, the more he perpetuates this narrative that, the Rwandan people are traumatized, Rwanda was hell. I mean, he came as some kind of savior. The more support he gets. And story of the genocide is so sacred to him, so important to him, that anyone who dares criticize that story, it doesn't matter if you're a survivor of genocide, it doesn't matter if you saw it, it doesn't matter if you know the truth of what happened, you lost a family member, you lost a parent, a child, whatever, you can't challenge his story of the genocide.
I have a personal testimony actually on that, because I'd survived that genocide. And, for many in the audience who haven't heard my story, it was to the point of actually having to dig my own grave during that genocide. And I have been to some of these official commemorations outside of Rwanda. The last one I went to was in 2018. The commemorations are not even commemorating the people who were killed. This isn't remembering. They're talking about, and the buildings and all kinds of, and the people who are leading them did not even, they didn't experience these things. These are people who are just helping the narrative control. So for many years, the government of Rwanda has asked me to change my story to only talk about what the extremist Hutu people did to a part of my family, but to leave out what the extremist Tutsis, the RPF, which is Kagame's party, did to a part of my family, and also to leave out what they did in the Congo, and to leave out basically everything leading up to the genocide and everything after the genocide, and also leave some of our personal experience out, things like fleeing to the Congo after, surviving genocide. So they wanted to, this is, like you said, it's narrative control. And I just wanted to share that testimony in support of what you basically just said. That is what happens. And a lot of people who survived the genocide, this is really right now, the people who are doing it now in very highly discriminatory fashion, even outside of the country, are the extremists, those who support the regime. A lot of the survivors who survived, who lived these traumatic experiences, they don't go to these things. They don't attend these things. Although one thing that's happening now, it started years ago, but it's catching on. I remember there was an organization called PAX in England that started in the early 2000s that wanted to do bring people to remember together, Tutsis and Hutus and Twas and everybody that basically every Rwandan lost people in that genocide, in that war, and all of that. And this organization tried, and it was a difficult time. They were traveling, across countries and things like that. And the government interfered with it. And then, fast forward, these kind of activities kept going. Of course, the non-extremists, people like Deo Mushahidi, who is in prison in Rwanda now, is a genocide survivor in prison in Rwanda because he exposed the crimes of the RPF. People like Prudentian Stewart, who led PAX, is under constant harassment, has been trapped, and they've tried to use friends to kill her, to poison her. And many other people, the name Mugenzi, who who actually introduced us, Anjan, years ago, they wanted to kill him in 2011 because he participates not only in these things, but he exposes the killings of the RPF. So anytime you take part in some of these things, the government will interfere. But the good thing, what I was saying is, in recent years, Rwandans are starting to free themselves, and they're telling their stories. They're telling their stories publicly. It's happening in Kinyarwanda right now, but we're going to continue to bring these stories in English and in other languages so that the rest of the world actually gets to know and gets to understand and gets to see the full spectrum of the experiences that Rwandans, experience. So I just wanted to share that short testimony, but also give the glimmer of hope on what's happening today. People are coming together, remembering together, and remembering everyone.
Also, speaking about yes, okay, yeah. Speaking about crimes by RPF, yeah, they only want to talk about this side of story, their narrative about Tutsis genocide, but they don't want other survivors who also survived RPF's killing to talk about their stories. And there is a story you mentioned in your book that actually also, it's very sad because it's something that's not being talked about, the Kufania, especially on child soldiers. Because Kagame, if some people don't know, Kagame's rebels, when they were under RPF, Rwandan Patriotic Front, when they first attacked Rwanda in 1990 and beyond until they got to power, they've used child soldiers, and that's an international crime. It has never been questioned about that. So after they took over the country, what happened to those child soldiers? Most of them have been killed. And Kufania method, it's one of the methods that were being used to kill some of the child soldiers and also some soldiers that they didn't want anymore. Tell us, what did you find about the Kufania?
Yeah, so I guess it was very surprising, right? So in Kagame's forces, there was a policy to even kill within the RPF's troops. They would kill mostly Francophone, from what I understand, educated young fighters, and they called it Kufania. And so there was internal killing within the RPF, within Kagame's forces. And this was kind of sanctioned. This was, apparently this was a way, they did this because they were worried that if they won the war, that these educated, articulate people would take all the good jobs. And so they would kill their own comrades, families from Burundi, other parts, families in exile, Tutsis in exile, would send their sons and their children to the RPF to invade Rwanda and take back the country. And then Kagame ended up killing many of these, children. And I guess, to talking about Kufania, talking about Claude's story, this for me is the biggest threat that Kagame has created for himself. There are so many people who have lost so many people close to them and who have shared with me in private their testimonies of, how they lost a father, an uncle, a sister, a child, and they can't talk about it. And Kagame doesn't let them talk about it. How can that continue? It's, those people, that is too deep. Kagame has controlled Rwanda to such a great degree, but I don't think you can control those deep ties. When people have lost loved ones, they want to talk about it. They want to commemorate that. They want to remember. Kagame doesn't allow them to. And so I think that will eventually, if I have to point to a source of hope, as Claude was saying, I think there are so many people like this because Kagame's forces committed so many atrocities, whether it's Kufania or the massacres within Rwanda or the mass graves in Congo. There are so many people who have lost loved ones to Kagame's forces that they will want to fight back. They will want their stories to be remembered one way or another.
All right.
And they will want change, and they will want their stories to be told. And so I think that even though Kagame tries to control the narrative, that's going to be his downfall, I think.
Yeah, there's so much injustice, and it's sad because it's been over almost 30. We are pretty much closing 30 years since Kagame took over the power, and people are still being followed for actually wanting to remember their loved ones, for telling the truth, and that's why we want the world to know, like, what we see, the narrative in the media, in mainstream media, is totally different from what people are actually experiencing in Rwanda. Yeah, so moving on, let's talk about Paul Rusesabagina. In this part of the story, I'm going to Claude Gatebuke, because he's one of the, he was a hotel manager in Kigali, one of the best hotels in Kigali, and he has saved a lot of lives during genocide. So right now, he's in prison in Rwanda after being kidnapped in Dubai. So Claude Gatebuke, can you tell us more and then also conduct this part of the broadcast?
Apologize, I was having technical problems. Anjan, this conversation has been so engaging, and it's been so interactive. I think we might just push you for a little bit of extra time. It's also needing to, the audience is, they've got a lot to say and share and ask you. And your fearlessness in just telling it the way it is, you're not holding back, and I think, the audience is just hungry and thirsty for it. And, from what I'm seeing, what's coming through, from our technical team, it's, you might be here all day, although we do have limited broadcast time. So, but the Paul Rusesabagina story, I've seen you talk about it, and it's one of the most prominent stories in the news when it comes to Rwanda right now. And it might actually be the opening to really mainstream media seeing what is happening and the government of Rwanda in the RPF. I know you know the story, so maybe I'll let you share with the audience what it is. But basically, I actually want to also thank you, Nadine, at the very beginning of the broadcast for giving the background to share with people who know Rwanda, even though we say that they know it because of the genocide. Film, Hotel Rwanda. Like, you go anywhere in the world, you say Rwanda, people know the film. They don't know anything about, they can't even point it out on the map. They've never heard of anybody, from that place. So thank you, Nadine, for making sure the audience understood that Rwanda is actually a country. It's not Zamunda. It's not Wakanda. There's actually a Rwanda. That's a real country. So, Anjan, the story of Paul Rusesabagina, what can you share with the audience and on his plight and what is happening today, and how this might be the opening, where the world actually gets to see what's happening to ordinary Rwandans?
Yeah, you're totally right. Like, a lot of people know Rwanda through that movie, Hotel Rwanda. And because of that movie, Paul Rusesabagina, who was a Hotel Rwanda manager, the real life person played by Don Cheadle in the movie. Paul Rusesabagina, he became famous for his actions as a hotel manager at the Hotel de Mille Collines, where he saved the lives of many people who were wanted by the government, and he risked his own life to save the lives of Tutsi people who were in the hotel. the story echoes Schindler's List from the Holocaust. So it just bravery at that time was very inspiring to a lot of people. So he became an international celebrity. He lived until recently, he lived in the US, where I met him. When my book Bad News came out, Paul was invited to one of my talks at the State Department, where I gave a talk to US government, and Paul was there, and I kind of gave my view on what I'd experienced in Rwanda to a wide swath of US government officials, from human rights, from the Pentagon, from intelligence, from various divisions. And at the end of my talk, Paul Rusesabagina, who had been sitting there quietly the whole talk, they asked him, "Do you have anything to add?" And actually, Paul said, "This young man has just said what I've been saying for the last 15 years. I have nothing more to say." So and so it was very moving to have him there and kind of corroborate. And I guess what you describe in the audience as well. People like Paul, people in the audience today, they know the truth, and they've been wanting to say it. They've been wanting to be, but it's and so I guess to have someone like me, a complete outsider, who has no stake in what happened in Rwanda, it's kind of reaffirming, and it's kind of it's events like what happened to Paul when he was kidnapped, and events like when I published my book, when I write about my experience. It brings to the mainstream what a lot of people are only able to say in private. And so what happened to Paul Rusesabagina was that he was recently kidnapped from Dubai, and Kagame is very scared of him because Paul, he's Hutu. Rwanda is majority Hutu. I think a lot of Hutus would vote for him if Paul would run for president. I think a lot of Tutsis would also vote for him because of his inspiring in saving Tutsis during the Rwandan genocide in '94. And so he's a very respected figure, and he's a real political threat to Kagame. And because of that, Kagame is very worried about him. He's orchestrated this campaign to smear Paul Rusesabagina and to say that he was extorting from people during the genocide and all kinds of allegations to discredit him. Because Kagame is so worried about Paul Rusesabagina's reputation. And I know the Hotel Rwanda movie, I've spoken to Terry George, who's director of Hotel Rwanda, and he's, described to me how much research went into that movie. They checked on Paul Rusesabagina's background. They talked to a number of witnesses. Terry George did real journalistic work. He didn't just make a movie based on what Paul told him. So it's well documented how Paul saved people's lives during the genocide. But Kagame has tried to smear his reputation, and because Kagame's narrative, we talked just before about how the genocide is so important to Kagame's power and his reputation abroad and inside Rwanda. And so in Kagame's story, there's only one hero from the genocide, and that's himself. And so Paul Rusesabagina cannot be this other hero. Kagame needs to discredit him and crush his reputation, because Kagame needs to make sure that he's the only hero. And so now what's happened is Rusesabagina is now in prison in Rwanda. And honestly, to cut a long story short, I think anyone who knows Rwanda, who knows Kagame, will be worried about whether Rusesabagina will survive, will exit Rwanda ever, will exit prison ever, and whether he will stay alive for how much longer. Because too many of Kagame's critics have ended up dead, have been found dead. And so Rusesabagina has many powerful friends, so it's a special case, but it remains to be seen whether Kagame will allow him to stay alive.
Yeah, I think that's very telling. If they would do something like that, the kidnapping, set him up, kidnap him. The Minister of Justice, Johnson Businge, admitted to Al Jazeera that they actually paid for the flight that brought him to Rwanda. If they would do that to him, and we know many people inside of the country, actually between the year 2005 and 2016, almost 600,000 young people, people our generation, between the age of 10 and 24 went missing in Rwanda, in a country that has umudugudu, where everybody's under surveillance. So you know that it's the government that's actually carrying out this kind of disappearances. Enforced disappearances is a big problem in the country. In recent times, there are so many people who have gone missing. One of the most famous ones within the Rwandan community is Bahati Musa, a poet, a well-known Rwandan poet. He's been missing since February. People go to travel to Rwanda and they go missing. They leave or surrounding countries. They go from the US, they go from Europe, they go from different places. I know people who have gone and they have been held in those torture chambers. And luckily, some of them are US citizens, and the US government has actually gone and reclaimed them. So there is definitely hope with Rusesabagina, because he has these powerful friends. But also, this is so prevalent, and if they could do it to somebody like him, the people who are unknown, it's even worse. But now I want to shift the conversation a little bit back to where we started, with the Congo. You went to Rwanda because you went to Congo. And, before the broadcast, I was joking with you about the story of the fan. I love that story in Stringer. I think it kind of shows, the freedom that you enjoy in a place like Congo. As poor as the people are, yes, it's not a perfect place, but you're much fear, and people are much more, able to talk to you and share their stories and things like that. And the contrast between Rwanda and Congo, both in terms of how people behave, how people are treated, and even, this culture of surveillance. And then the contrast in the stories, again, the story of the genocide of Rwanda has been told so many places. And then to find the story of the Congo, you have to go and find where it's buried in the middle of a newspaper, which thank goodness, brought you from Yale to Congo to Rwanda. Now you're here, right? Started from the bottom, now we're here. Or started from from Yale, and now we're here. But I guess, how is it, or what's it gonna take for actually the world to get awareness? Because it's gonna take awareness for people to act on what's happening in the Congo and what's happened in the Congo, because the pursuit of justice is not gonna stop. We are not planning to stop anything in terms of pursuing justice for the millions, almost 10 million Congolese people who have been killed since the invasion of Rwanda in Congo. And as you stated, Kagame is a puppet of the West. But what is it going to take to get the people aware of what is actually happening in the Congo? Because the contrast is really black and white. And, black and white, I mean literally and figuratively, and I also mean in the racism. Like, how can you have 10 million people killed, the deadliest conflict since World War II, and nobody knows about it, but every one of us is carrying a piece of the Congo with us. What's it gonna take?
Yeah, I guess the short answer is, people like yourself, and I think there are a number of examples. I think as a journalist, I only tell stories that I hear from other people. So when I was in Rwanda, when I was in Congo at the sites of the mass graves, people were brave enough to share their stories with me, which they can't share in public. And I think people like yourself, who are outside Rwanda, who've grown up abroad, who can influence people back home. Because, don't forget, even Kagame grew up in exile. Yeah, he grew up in Uganda, and then he grew up.
Yeah, and he didn't have Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and all of these tools that we have today, right?
Yeah, exactly. But he grew up and Rwanda back then, even before Kagame invaded and the genocide happened and all that. Yeah, Rwanda was also a place with injustices, and Kagame grew up outside in a community of Rwandans outside who were sensitive to those injustices, and then they made change. And I think that's why Kagame is so worried that somebody's going to invade, somebody's going to do to him what he did to the previous regime. and the more people like yourself who speak up, the easier it is for journalists like myself, and the others. Judy Revere, we haven't mentioned her yet, and her book.
And let's call out the name of the book. It's called "In Praise of Blood: The Crimes of the RPF." I think it's important that the audience knows and able to purchase. By the way, commercial break real quick. Everybody, please go to Amazon and buy the books "Bad News: The Last Journalist in a Dictatorship." Nadine is holding the book up. Also, buy the book "Stringer." The experiences, the experiences in Rwanda and Congo and pick up a copy of "In Praise of Blood." There's also another book that I recommend by Helen called "Another Fine Mess: America, Uganda, and the War the War on Terror." Those books, if you can pick up those 4 books, that's I think you would not be disappointed in how much you learn. So that was the commercial break. But to end the commercial break, next Saturday we have another broadcast similar to this, where we will be covering. Let's see, just real quick, the making of Paul Kagame, who really pulls the strings. And our guest is going to be Madhav Narayan, who is the co-founder of the Intrepid Citizen. So next Saturday, same time, same place, both on so on your local televisions through HMG Broadcasting, but also on YouTube, HMG, where you're watching right now, and on Aglan, where you're also following right now. So back to the main subject. Anjan, back to you.
Yeah, I guess just to reiterate, I think it's people who, like yourselves, who are brave, who are speaking about things that a lot of people are afraid to speak about. I mean, to be honest, Kagame's machine is very scary. A lot of people, his surveillance machine in Rwanda, outside Rwanda, people harassing you outside Rwanda. It's not easy to talk about topics like this. And so, I think you're doing very important work in elevating these stories, in showing other people in your communities that it's okay to talk about them. And so we as journalists, we're just messengers. So we come and we hear your stories and then we write them down as best as we can. And that's why I mentioned Judy and her book. And the easier it is to access these stories and access the truth, the quicker it'll be that the narrative changes, and that what happened in Congo and the crimes committed by Kagame's forces, all of these things, the true picture, the full picture of that region, of all the war and all the injustice in that region will come to light. Because it's important, and I hear it when I hear you speak, Claude. When you tell your story, when you share your story, I hear how meaningful it is to you, and I hear it when Nadine, points out things in my book that, surprised her. I feel in you how important it is to hear the truth, because it resonates with what you've been hearing in your communities, from your families, from other people who've been in Rwanda, whom you've met. But it's hard to access the truth in the mainstream media. And so, the more we talk about it, the better it will be. And eventually the truth will come out. As Václav Havel said in the Czech Republic, eventually the truth came out. The dictatorship fell, the truth came out, the activists won, and you have to kind of believe that will happen at some point.
So
also, before we move on, I would like to ask you a question, like for people who are not Rwandans, like people who are foreigners, who are visiting Rwanda, based on your experience, because most of the people, they go there, they see the light, the clean streets. They don't see nothing about poverty. They don't hear nothing about people suffering. And everybody comes back in the West impressed, the clean city, like everything is nice and beautiful. So what would you tell like somebody who is a foreigner who is visiting Rwanda? What do they have to look for besides the light, the clean streets of Kigali?
I don't know. I think you have to first want to look. I think many people who go to Rwanda are looking for that positive story, right? They're looking for the clean streets. They're looking for the positive story. They're looking for the story that Kagame has sold them. And so they don't want to look elsewhere. I think, I would make good friends, talk to people, because once you get really close to someone, they will tell you the truth once they trust you. And that's what happened to me. My Rwandan, colleagues, my students, the journalists whom I was teaching, they decided to be brave and to share with me things that were very dangerous to say in Rwanda. And they trusted me. So human relationships, that's how one person at a time, how you get to the truth, how you understand. And many of those people whom you mentioned, who go to Rwanda and see all the clean streets and the lights and think, oh my God, this is paradise. Many of them have changed. Many of them, as they stay there longer and get to know Rwandans longer. I remember I met recently, Isaac Chung. He's completely, heard of him. He's up for Best Director Oscar just now for his movie Minari. So he's been nominated for an Oscar for Best Director and Best Picture. And he speak to his classroom in Korea. He was teaching journalism. And he introduced me to his documentary filmmaking class in Korea. He made a film about Rwanda himself. He told me that he went to Rwanda. He was training Rwandan filmmakers. And, he got close to some of his students. And then one of his students, like so many Rwandans, had trouble and then had to flee the country. And every time Isaac, my friend, would try to contact this filmmaker, Rwandan filmmaker, the Rwandan filmmaker would be very cryptic and not answer where he was, not give him information. And then finally he showed up in Montreal. And finally Isaac was able to contact him and be like, hey man, what happened? Like, what happened to you? I haven't been able to talk to you in like 6 months. And so this Rwandan filmmaker apparently told Isaac, there's this book called Bad News by Anjan Sundaram. I don't know Anjan, I'm not in the book, but read that. That's exactly what happened. And so, it's a story that has happened to so many people. And if you get to know people well, if you make personal connections, they will tell you the truth. Even taking risks, even when it's risky for them, even knowing that Kagame's government might imprison them or harm them, they will still take that risk because these stories are important. The truth's important. And so that's why you're sharing truth today. That's why I wrote my book, Bad News, because so many Rwandan journalists had paid with their lives and, imprisoned and tortured for speaking the truth. And I wanted to pay homage to them, to their work, important work. And so that's why I wrote Bad News. And so piece by piece, and Judy Revere wrote her book because of similar things. And so piece by piece, the true map emerges.
Yeah. So I have hope too, because recently I'm seeing a lot of independent televisions in Rwanda coming up. I mean, these journalists really do a lot. Like the popular one that I keep saying is Chuma Hassan. Thank you so much for the good work, because he actually goes out there in those villages where there is no light and talk to people and what they are dealing with day by day. That's how he was able to find out about the family who just lost their loved one after being shot by the Rwandan police, and then they don't even want to give them the body of the victim to the family so they can bury him. So stories like those that we never hear about. So there are a lot of journalists who are coming up and trying to do the good work and trying to let the world out there know what is happening. So I have hope.
Yeah.
And
go ahead.
I would be remiss not to also thank the ones who came before, like your students, Jean Bosco Gasasira and Agnes Wimana, and the Didas Gasanas and the Nelson Gatsimbazis and the Alenia Sakangas, and just all the ones who came up in the 2000s and ended up fleeing. And today we just have to preserve and make sure that these ones don't end up harmed.
Right.
But Chuma Hassan, it would be remiss if we didn't mention that he served a whole year in pre-trial detention. He just got released last month in March of this year. He was arrested in April of 2020 for reporting on the destruction of houses of people during the pandemic, and also the rape of women in one of the most popular neighborhoods in Rwanda, where Rwandan soldiers were basically using the cover of the darkness. Because again, like you said, when we shine light on these things, there is hope. And that's what we need to continue to do. So he was shining a light on the darkness of the crimes that the soldiers were committing against these women, and he paid a heavy price. He was tortured. He's talked about how he was tortured, but he's very brave, and it's very it brings a lot of hope. But before we end this broadcast, we need to also allow the audience to speak to you. So we've got some questions from the audience. But before that, I wanted to check and test your Kinyarwanda. So, Amakuru. So you see that? Where's the bad news? Every time somebody asks, what's the news? It's always just good news, right? There is also this catering to foreigners. I don't know how you were able to escape that part where Rwanda kind of caters its image to foreigners. So that's one of the things that came in the comments. If maybe I want to take multiple questions at the same time. That way, you can answer them, however you like. But there's a few of them related to that. There is international, are the international so this one from Peter Verlinden, are international organizations for press freedom and journalists doing enough to support the brave Rwandan journalists? Also talked about some figures. How is it that Kagame still enjoys the freedom and the support of the West, given his poor record on human rights and press freedom? I think you talked about that already. I think it's also, we've got a few questions here. Related to some of the people who support him, which you've mentioned some of them: Tony Blair, Bill Clinton, Paul Farmer, a whole bunch of others. And then the mapping report. There's momentum building right now around the mapping report, and Dr. Denis Mukwege has really shone a bright light on the mapping report and the prospect for justice and the push for international justice, because the crimes that were committed in the Congo were international crimes. They were committed by outside players, most of them by the Rwandan troops. This has brought some backlash to, including insecurity. And I mentioned earlier, General James Kabarebe, who not only, just last year said that there was not a person killed in the Congo because you cannot find the body of the millions of people killed, but also said that Dr. Mukwege was running propaganda and threatened him. He ended up getting some backlash, but now Dr. Mukwege is under special protection because of that. Again, I want to commend our Congolese brothers and sisters who continue to push for justice, because I think justice will lead to peace. Peace is not going to come before justice and reconciliation, like they do in Rwanda, where they think you can just jump right to reconciliation before you do truth-telling and justice. I also think that's kind of like putting on your shoes and then putting your socks, on top of the shoes. It doesn't work like that. So can you talk about, some of those, address those questions, but especially there's a lot of interaction on the mapping report in the international community's support for Kagame and how that may interfere, or how he may lose it as a result of this campaign on the mapping report.
Yeah, so I think, Denis Mukwege is, because he won the Nobel Peace Prize, has risen to prominence and now has the ear of many powerful people. So I think, he's been influential in recent years. I met him as well, like 5 years ago when I gave this talk at the Oslo Freedom Forum. He gave a talk at the same conference in Norway, and he was talking about the mapping report and raising awareness about it. And I guess the level of his influence shows in the fact that he's now facing insecurity himself. I guess to your point about the reconciliation, I think it's telling that in South Africa you had truth and reconciliation, and in Rwanda you had peace and reconciliation. So the truth was missing in Rwanda. In Rwanda they tried to skip the truth part, which they did in South Africa, and they just tried to say everything's peaceful, everything is calm, and everyone's happy. To Peter Verlinder's question, I think that's an important question. These brave Rwandan journalists, are they getting support? I don't think they're getting enough support. When I was trying to help the journalists in Rwanda, it was very difficult to get support for them. And I think I would single out Reporters Without Borders for really good work. They are responsive and they are helping people, helping journalists in trouble. And I think I have a lot of respect for that organization, how they work, how hands-on they were to help the Rwandan journalists when they were having trouble. But because of Kagame's propaganda, not enough resources have been put into the human rights side. Human Rights Watch has been releasing reports, and I have friends there who've been doing very important, very brave work. But it's been slow, it's been a slog. But as you're saying, nowadays more and more people are willing to listen, and the narrative is shifting. Already, like for people in the know, I remember 6 years ago when my book Stringer came out about Congo, I was in New York. Already people were saying, the Rwanda narrative needs to change, and it's taken 7 years, and progress has been made, but it's moving in that direction, I would say. And I think the mapping report is an important piece of that because, so often Kagame's critics are discredited. People say, oh, they're just lying, they're making it up. But the mapping report documents crimes by Kagame's forces that are on such a huge scale across so many different sites across Congo. Maybe one person is lying, maybe two people are lying. You can't have people, when I was in Congo, people in Equateur, in the west of Congo, and people in the Kivu, in the east of Congo, were describing very similar mechanisms for how people were killed in mass graves, how Kagame's forces were doing the killings. And these people were separated by thousands of kilometers. People can't make up similar stories from thousands of kilometers apart. And so that's the importance of the mapping report. You have so many different sites across Congo. You can't coordinate or lie. You can't say that they're all lying, or they all, it's a conspiracy theory. They all talk to each other and made up a story. No, it's just too obvious. And so I think Denis Mukwege is right to focus on that mapping report and shed light on that, because I think that will show in verifiable and very clearly documented ways the violence that Kagame has perpetrated on the region. And maybe from there, it'll be easier to talk about the violence that Kagame has perpetrated in Rwanda, including on genocide survivors and their families. And and maybe the truth will eventually come out. I still think the donors and the international community are still scared. They're like, if Kagame, who else? Kagame has eliminated all his opponents. They're all in exile. And I think some of them, like Paul Rusesabagina, they need to be brought forward as well, because the international community is worried. They're like, oh, if Kagame falls and there's violence again, will we be blamed for that again, as we were in 1994, the international community? That's kind of a fear that people have, that the international community, foreign countries have. They're like, as long as things are stable in Rwanda today, maybe we just leave things as they are. But that's obviously not the solution, because the violence is rising and rising, and any transition will probably be accompanied by even more violence. And so,
and also adding to that, people don't even imagine how, like Congo, the victims of war that was waged by Paul Kagame in Congo, the victims, the amount of people who have died are almost like 10 times more than people who died in Rwanda. And we still don't hear anything about Congo. And they are still dying. It's not like the war is over or the crimes in Congo are over. Rwanda is still playing on the soil of Congo. They are still killing people in Congo. And but barely hear anything about that. But we hear a lot about Rwandan genocide, and Congo is always forgotten. So that's something that definitely has to come to light.
Yeah, I think what Anjan just said definitely shows why we have to continue doing this kind of work and continue to put this forward, because they fear that Kagame, when he leaves or if he goes now, which, you know, of course, there's all this talk about him being dead or very sick, that the international community is worried about violence, but there is like 10 million dead bodies in the Congo, you know, as a result of Kagame. There is almost the same number of people who were killed in the genocide went missing between 2005 and 2016. So, you know, and these are all in the reports, the State Department reports, you know, there's all these human rights reports that come out, the torture, you know, all of these things that are happening with Kagame are not going to be the same with, you know, the system, the RPF system. As you said, what happened in Western Congo, and just to give the picture of the size of the Congo, is basically pretty much all of the US east of the Mississippi. It's a large piece of land, and it's very systematic how they kill the people. That's why the stories you hear are so similar. The stories are the same in Rwanda, in the Congo. So, you know, you go from Boston all the way down to Miami, you know, and you go from Minnesota, Minneapolis, all the way down, all the way across down to Miami, and the stories are the same, you know, these systematic killings. And so I think it's important that we continue to have these conversations. There was a comment that I wanted to point out to you as we give you the floor back to give your closing remarks, Anjan, that pointed out the hypocrisy of Paul Kagame complaining about the international community when he's committing all these atrocities and getting all this support from the international community. It came from Louise Wachu, who is the host of the UNI talk show. She's the host of it, and I'm sure she's read your book. And so shout out to her for pointing this out. And just wanted to turn it back over to you to give your closing remarks, because there's so many questions and comments from the audience. We're not going to be able to go through all of them, but we would like to invite you again at some point in the future, if you will allow us. Thank you so much for your time with us.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's very kind. And Nadine, it's really moving to see sort of you go scene by scene, and how to hear from you, you know, as a reader, even not just as a host of this session, but as a reader, to hear your reaction to each of the scenes. And it seems like everything I wanted to communicate, you understood perfectly. Like you know, even why I thought the lights or the grenades were important to put in the book, you touch on exactly the point that I wanted to make. And so it's very moving for me to hear that. And yeah, just to thank everyone who joined today for listening in. And I think, as Claude said, it's very important to continue to speak, and I'm sure you will, and you will find more journalists like myself and others who will be inspired by the stories that you tell and want to share them. And the more that these stories are repeated and shared more widely, the more the narrative, Kagame's narrative, is broken, and the narrative of the region changes. Because don't forget, there have been journalists like Howard French and, you know, all the way back in real time, who are saying what we're saying today. So this fight has been waged for a long time, and this fight to change the narrative. And I think eventually the truth will come out and will win. And I think there are a lot of people like us waiting in the wings. And as more people join the cause and, you know, bring different perspectives and different angles, it creates a huge jigsaw puzzle that you can't just break down and discredit. There are too many independent sources who are all credible, who are all saying the same thing, and eventually the truth will have to be accepted. I think it was it's one of Kofi Olomide's songs. He had a line that I like, that the lies take the elevator, but the truth takes the stairs, but eventually it gets there.
That's right. Now we know for sure that you lived in the Congo. Can you dance to some of the Kofi Olomide music?
Yeah, I never went to Fikin. I never went to his concert in the Fikin.
Oh man.
But,
yeah. I think Nadine also has some of the lyrics that she likes. Anachukua,
Anachukua, anaweka wa. So you take anachukua, it's take, and then you put, and then then the goal.
So we're gonna take it. We're gonna take our stories. We're gonna put them in the in the public, and wow, the world is gonna know what is happening. One more time, I just wanted to thank you for bringing up Howard French. Most people do not know about Howard French's work in on Congo and Rwanda. Please look up his articles, read his books, and he's also in. Also Bad News. Remember to go on Amazon and buy the book. Also Stringer, also by Anjan Sundaram. We wanted to thank our sponsors today, HMG Studio. We wanted to also thank Friends of the Congo, who have a film, by the way, that Howard French is in. The short film is called Crisis in the Congo. Check it out. It also gives a picture on YouTube. Wanted to thank the African Great Lakes Action Network, which I belong to, AGLAN, and Black Star News, all of our sponsors. Nadine, I want to turn it over to you to close out this broadcast, and thank you everybody in the audience today.
Yeah, thank you everyone. Thank you, Anjan Sundaram, for actually accepting our invitation here. I'm very happy to actually host this broadcast, because this is the truth. We have to let the world know. Like we always talk about this stuff, but most of the time we talk these things in Kinyarwanda. But we just want everybody to know, because the world has a completely narrative of what happened. They have no idea what is happening in Rwanda and in the whole region as a whole, in Congo especially. Congo has to come up, because what is happening there right now, it's ridiculous. People are dying every day and nobody's saying anything. But so I would like to thank everybody for tuning in, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Nadine. Thank you, Claude. And thank you everyone in back office, Freeman, and everyone else who made this happen.
All right. Anachukua, anaweka.
Wow.